Hey guys, thanks for joining me for another time to study God's Word. Today we are in Acts chapter 27. That's right, we're almost finished. One more week of Acts. But just a quick recap of last week's lesson on chapter 26. Paul had been brought before King Agrippa, Bernice, and Governor Festus so that maybe Agrippa might help Festus with some wording of the charges against Paul as he sends him to Rome. Paul tells of his past, steeped in the Jewish religion, and the persecution of the church. He cast his vote against many and took many of them into custody in order to be tried for placing their faith in Jesus. He also told how Jesus met him on the road to Damascus in order to confront him about this persecution that he had brought upon the body of Christ. Plus, Paul would be called to become a messenger of the message of Jesus Christ to the Gentiles of all people. He was now on trial because he believed in the message of the Messiah, the Christ, and that his death and subsequent resurrection was a part of God's plan all along. The prophets and the works of Moses testified to this fact. Festus thought that Paul had lost his mind, and Agrippa, well, he was confronted by Paul as to whether he believed it or not. At this point, the meeting was quickly adjourned, and the Roman officials agreed that Paul should be set free. But you see, he had appealed to Caesar, and to Caesar he would go. So, let's look at chapter 27. Let's begin with the first 8 verses here. It says, when it was decided that we should sail for Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius who belonged to the imperial regiment. We boarded a ship from Adramyttium about to sail for ports along the coast of the province of Asia, and we put out to sea. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was with us. The next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius, in kindness to Paul, allowed him to go to his friends so they might provide for his needs. From there, we put out to sea again and passed to the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. When we had sailed across the open sea off the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us on board. We made slow headway for many days and had difficulty arriving off Cnidus. When the wind did not allow us to hold our course, we sailed to the lee of Crete opposite Salome. We moved along the coast with difficulty and came to a place called Fair Havens near the town of Lasea. Well, Paul is finally on his way to Rome. He was taken on board a ship with other prisoners at the hands of a centurion, and we're actually given his name, Julius. They boarded a coastal ship until they could find a ship sailing across the sea to Rome. If you notice, we pick up the pronoun we here once again. So Luke must have rejoined the apostle as he was taking this trip to Rome. Aristarchus also joined them, we're told. The next day, they landed at Sidon, a town 69 miles north of Caesarea. Here, the centurion allows Paul the freedom to go see his friends there. There was no doubt a church that had been planted in this area, and we should probably assume that there was a guard that accompanied Paul and his companions. But from there they set out and passed to the east and north of the island of Cyprus, for the winds were apparently westerly during this time of year, and still are. Their next landing was at Myra. It was here that a ship could be found going on to Rome. And it was here that ships taking grain from Egypt to Rome could be located and boarded. The winds made the going slow. They had apparently shifted to the northwest. So from Myra, they made their way to Cnidus. They had a choice to stop and harbor here or continue on, and they chose the latter. They sailed to the lee or east and south of Crete. They continued along the coast and with great difficulty made it to Fair Havens. It was in this small harbor that they stopped and waited for better winds. Verses 9 through 13 says, much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous because by now it was after the fast. So Paul warned them, men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo, and to our own lives also. But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and the owner of the ship. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. This was a harbor in Crete facing both southwest and northwest. When a gentle south wind began to blow, they thought they had obtained what they wanted. So they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. So it had become apparent that the dangerous season of sailing had begun. It began around sort of the middle of September and lasted for at least a couple of months. And after this time, all sailing would end until the winter was over. Paul steps up and warns them not to try and sail any farther. In other words, they should remain in Fair Havens there until the winter had ended. If they failed to take his advice, then there would be some grave circumstances. The pilot and the owner of the ship disagreed with Paul. They felt that Phoenix would be a much greater harbor to spend the winter. When a gentle south wind began to blow, they thought that they had their chance, that they could make their way to Phoenix. And they weighed anchor, sailed close to the shoreline of Crete, and hopefully within just a few hours, maybe they would be in a safe harbor again. Or so they thought. It said in verses 14 through 19, before very long, a wind of hurricane force called the northeaster swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind, so we gave way to it and were driven along. As we passed to the lee of a small island called Cauda, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure. When the men had hoisted it aboard, they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together, fearing that they would run aground on the sandbars of Syrtis. They lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. We took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. So they were suddenly hit by this storm, this northeaster, which swept down from the island. They were suddenly caught up in a deadly situation and was forced to try and just be pushed along by the winds. As they caught a small amount of relief by the small island of Cauda, it was there that they were able to get their dinghy or lifeboat aboard. They were able to get it secured, and it was usually just being towed along behind the larger ship, but during the storms, bad storms, it was brought aboard. Then they began to pass ropes underneath the ship in order to try and hold the ship together, its beams together at least, during the battering that it was taken by the storm. It says they lowered the sea anchor, which would have slowed them down and made them drift at a slower pace anyway. It's probably sort of a floating anchor, as we call it. They were taking such a beating that the crew even began to throw their cargo overboard. They were literally throwing their income overboard. And if that wasn't enough, on the third day of drifting in this story, they threw over the ship's tackle. It was going from bad to worse for sure, for everybody on board. And then verses 20 through 26, we read, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. After the men had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourselves this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. Last night an angel of God, whose I am and whom I serve, stood beside me and said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island. Can you imagine just being stuck on a ship for many days during this unending storm? I won't ask you to close your eyes and imagine it. You might just get sick thinking about it. But we can only imagine how many had already put their heads over the side of the boat, sick, and how tired and miserable they all were. There was no escape other than what they thought, death. Out of nowhere, Paul stands up and he tells them, well, you got to love Paul. He says, I told you so. You have to hate it when somebody tells you that, even if it's true. But he stands up, he tells them that they should have listened to him in the first place, and this would not have happened. If only we had remained in the safe harbor without trying to make it on to Phoenix. Then he said something that had to raise a few eyebrows. An angel had appeared to him in the night and told him not to be afraid. He would survive as well as all of those on the ship with him. He would indeed make it out alive and well to appear before Caesar in Rome. Paul told them to keep their courage, but they had to run aground on some island in order to be saved from the storm. Paul's mind had been set at ease by the words of this angel, and now he hoped that the crew would be encouraged as well and listen to him this time. Verse 27 through 29 says, on the 14th night, we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea. When about midnight, the sailors sensed they were approaching land. They took soundings and found that the water was 120 feet deep. A short time later, they took soundings again and found it was 90 feet deep. Fearing that we would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. Well, they were now 2 weeks into the storm. On that night, the sailors sensed they were approaching land. How did they sense it? Did they hear the breaking sea on the shore? We don't know. We aren't told here, but they take soundings and find that the water went from 120 foot deep to 90 feet deep in just a short period of time. They were undoubtedly getting closer to land, so they put down the anchors to hold them fast until daylight. This way they would, and they put the anchors in from the stern. This way they'd be pointed toward the shore when daylight broke. They could cut the lines and allow the boat to hopefully run aground bow first. What could they do at this point but pray for daylight to come and illuminate this, bad situation that they're in? Verses 30 through 32 says, in an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let the lifeboat down into the sea, pretending they were going to lower some anchors from the bow. Then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved. So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it fall away. Some of the sailors attempted to make sure they would make it out of this situation alive anyway, at the expense of all the others on board. You see, they were going to jump ship, try to escape in the life raft before the ship ran aground. The ship would have had even less chance with no skilled sailors left there. But Paul warned the centurion of their plan, so the soldiers came and cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and, let it go. And I guess the centurion had learned his lesson and now decided to actually listen to the words of Paul. I can only imagine what the sailors were thinking at this point. Maybe there was even a mutiny brewing, I don't know. But they all were afraid. They were all wet. They were all exhausted. And verses 30 through 38 says, just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. For the last 14 days, he said, you have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head. After he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. Then he broke it and began to eat. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. Altogether, there were 276 of us on board. When they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. Well, just before they were able to see daylight, Paul told them that they should eat something. They had hardly eaten anything, maybe nothing, for some 2 weeks now during the storm. So it was time to eat and be strengthened by the food for the day ahead and the swim ahead. Paul offered some further encouragement to the crew and passengers. He again reassured them that none of them would lose their lives. He said, you won't even lose a hair on your head. So they all ate something after Paul himself broke bread and prayed to it and took some himself in front of them all. But here we find out just how large the ship had to be. It was large enough for 276 people to be on board, not to mention all the cargo. All hope of saving this ship was apparently lost, so they lightened up their load by throwing off the grain that they had brought. So much for any income on this trip. This was the last thing they could throw overboard. Well, except, of course, people. Verses 39 through 44 says, when daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy beach, where they decided to run the ship aground if they could. Cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea, and at the same time untied the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and made for the beach. But the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. The bow struck fast and would not move, and the stern was broken to pieces by the pounding of the surf. The soldiers planned to kill the soldiers to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping, but the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to get there on planks or on pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone reached land in safety. Daylight came, and they saw just really what they wanted to see. They saw land and they saw a beach. Even though it was unfamiliar land, an unfamiliar beach, it was a welcome sight. They had made all the preparations they could for running the ship aground in the right direction, so they cut loose the anchors, put up the little sail that was left, and head for shore. They couldn't make the shore because they hit a sandbar, so the stern of the ship began to come apart from the battering of the waves from behind, and they were desperate, to say the least. The soldiers were even making their own plans. They would kill all the prisoners to keep them from escaping. After all, they would be held personally responsible for any of these prisoners who escaped their custody. Fortunately, the centurion found out and stopped these murderous plans. He wanted to make sure Paul made it to Rome. He ordered those that could swim to jump overboard first and make way for the shore, and those that couldn't swim would grab pieces of the ship and boards, and maybe they could float ashore. And lo and behold, Paul was right. Everyone made it ashore alive. Makes you want to go on a cruise right now, doesn't it? But God promises all of us a way to make it out of this life safely into His arms, might I add. And it is only through Jesus Christ that we can do such things. Well, may God bless you and keep you, give you peace till we can meet again here. Study God's Word.